and then we can go. All right, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. This is the Facilitation Basics Workshop for Extension Agents. And as we said in the Tuesday letter and the first Friday call, chances are if you haven't already had the opportunity to facilitate a discussion in Extension, you are going to probably have that opportunity in the future. So it's great to have those extra tools and knowledge to go into that situation so you can do the best you possibly can. And with us today from the ICDD, the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy, is Dr. Tim Shaffer and his team who will be presenting. So thanks, Tim and team, for coming today and presenting the workshop, and for everyone else who signed up and showed up today. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. It's really great to be with all of you. There might still be a few more who will join us, but it looks like we have a pretty healthy group here today, which is great. So thanks for taking some time here on a Monday afternoon. As Jan said, and as I said a little bit ago, my name is Tim Shaffer. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies and the director for the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy here at K-State. And for those who are unfamiliar with ICDD, it was established with this very intentional kind of mission aligned with our Center for Engagement and Community Development, kind of in this space of saying, how do we have greater engagement and interaction with one another, not just on campus, but also beyond. And so ICDD has long played a role in helping to facilitate conversations in all sorts of places with different communities. Maybe some of you have been part of those in the past, various collaborations. But ICDD has, I think, this really wonderful opportunity. I'm grateful for Jan and for Trudy and others who have really been some champions of some of this work and finding places where we align organizationally, because we have truly a shared mission, which is some of what we're gonna be talking about today, especially some of this framing that we really want to, I think, better understand where some of this is coming from. So historically, particularly for extension, as we think about some of the contemporary practices, as it relates to some of the explicit KSRE work that's going on around the master facilitators work. So this is really seen as a little bit of introduction to some of that material that's related to that, to frame that a bit, if that still feels like you don't totally understand all of that, or you're just not aware of it yet. But really in I think as a robust kind of complementary way as possible. So today also you're gonna hear another voice and see a face. Lance Rossi is a research assistant with ICDD, and so he's going to actually be talking a little bit about a couple of methods we're going to talk about in a bit. So he's going to help kind of lead some of those conversations, and also Donna Shank-Hamlin, who has been with ICDD since the beginning, helped make the thing what it is, and is not necessarily presenting, but is going to be another kind of voice to, I think, offer some perspective. And be able to respond to some questions and things that people will have. So maybe that's my way of saying today is really designed to be some presentation. There's going to be a little bit of interactions, conversations, and things that will happen in a bit. But it's if you've got a question, or if all of a sudden a slide goes faster than you thought or whatever, please don't kind of hesitate to raise a hand or the chat box. I'll kind of be paying attention, and others will as well. But you know, we can see this as being more conversational, and so don't feel like you're gonna kind of mess anything up if you raise a question. So with all that said, let's kind of get started. Oh, and the other thing I was going to say that just reminded me, if you're not muted, you might want to mute, just for practical purposes. I don't know. I heard an errant sound somewhere. All right, good. So let me start here. Actually, with one of my favorite images that I came across at the beginning of actually the pandemic last year, when I was trying to look at how K-State was responding to the 1918 flu, what we for a long time referred to as the Spanish flu. And I came across in that process this image. This is an image that was used at least, probably in other times as well, but at least in 1918 and 1919 for the booklet for courses and programs and things that were being offered here at K-State, as you can see, the Kansas State Agricultural College. The reason I want to start here is, and it's a little bit difficult to see, you can see extension service kind of written there in the black. But in many ways, this is similar in some fashion to what is more commonly known as the Wisconsin idea, the sense of the state as the campus. The boundaries of the campus are those of the state. And so as we think about the importance and necessity of kind of creating conditions and engaging people as robustly as possible and as intentionally as possible around issues of challenging, kind of problems we're facing through civil discourse, let's kind of keep this in the back of our mind, this idea that, and you know this, right? You exist in this way, but really thinking about who we are collectively as K-State being this, right? Truly responsive across our entire state. So how we're going to use our time. I'm going to frame a little bit of this here. We got some ground rules that I want to talk about a bit. And then also highlight a little bit and just kind of pose, even as a chance for some conversation, this idea of the role of the facilitator. We're also going to kind of step back a little bit, kind of looking at the kind of current kind of climate that we're in, what's shaping why we're kind of functioning in some of these ways. We're going to present a little bit about the streams of engagement, these kind of different ways we could think about communication and facilitation of that being essential. And we're going to then offer a couple dives into visual thinking strategies and then also World Cafe, right? So these will be opportunities for us to actually experience a little bit of this, what we're talking about. And then we're going to kind of end up, we'll have some chances for some debrief within those themselves. But at the very end of our time together, we'll have a chance for some reflection on this overall, and then kind of pointing to some other resources and some things for next steps, since there will be continued opportunities going forward. So that's how we're going to use our time. So I want to start here, though, before I even get to our ground rules. And I love this quote from Miles Horton, who founded an educational space still in existence called Highlander. At that time, the Highlander Folk School, now the Highlander Education and Resource Center. And in a book, his autobiography, The Long Haul, writes this: the best ways of educating people is to give them an experience that embodies what you are trying to teach. When you believe in a democratic society, you provide a setting for education that is democratic. So I include this here because these principles that we're going to explain in just a moment really capture, I think, these ideas that we all want to be participating equally and fully here, but also significantly making sure that we're not just having the opportunity to speak, but also to really listen and to listen deeply. So ICDD has principles of civic discourse. I'm going to talk through these somewhat quickly, but I think they really provide some good framework and some parameters for how we want to think about civil discourse. So fundamentally, we want to seek understanding in places where we have common ground. And for you, as you're thinking about the idea of facilitating conversations in your respective kind of environments, whether it's a community with a standing organization or maybe people who don't know one another, this idea of being able to find kind of shared interests and common ground is important. But it's not necessarily always the case. And we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later, around this idea of maybe not always trying to get consensus, for example. So seeking understanding is kind of first and foremost here. And inherent with that is expecting and being able to navigate and explore kind of conflicting viewpoints, perspectives, being able to unpack that and have some understanding and expectation that that's going to be part of what happens here is really important for us. Related, everyone ideally, and as best as possible for you as a facilitator, is to create conditions for people to have the opportunity to speak. Doesn't necessarily mean everyone has to. So this is not a situation where you have to go around a circle and say you're next and you're next and you're next. But giving people the opportunity to speak is a critical kind of foundational practice. If people, especially if they feel like they're not the loudest voices or the kind of the biggest actors in a room, that they can and should be part of what's going on. The flip of that is for people to be able to listen respectfully and thoughtfully. So listening to understand is a critical piece here. So it's not just about having the opportunity to have some floor time, but being able to listen and kind of pose questions and kind of probe a little bit so you can better understand what's going on. So even thinking about your opportunities to speak really might be more clarifying what somebody else is saying. Something we added a few years ago, and I think in the preparation for today, we talked about kind of the environment that we find ourselves in. This ability to actually offer and support your claims is really, really essential. And this doesn't mean necessarily having fact sheets or the latest research. It could be some of that, but it can also be through your lived experience and observation. What you really want to have, and ideally we'll have this happen today too, is that if you're going to say something, it's something that you can speak from a place of experience or observation. So getting away from, I heard somewhere, right? Those kinds of statements are not really very helpful. So if we could avoid that, that would be great. Recognizing also that people will speak differently. I don't want to make assumptions about who's in this room right now, but we are operating under the assumption that we can all kind of speak together in English, right? So being able to do that is something that for some of you, you'll want to be very intentional about in your communities, depending on what you're trying to do. If you really want to include everybody, then you might have to think about that more broadly. But not just that, is also the sense of some people are very comfortable speaking publicly and others are not. So recognizing that and giving them space, right, as we say earlier, giving everybody the opportunity to speak might mean we really need to appreciate the fact that we're going to have some variation there. And then the last two, and I want to be mindful of this so I can keep going, is we're going to try to stay focused on our issues, the topics, and then finally kind of respecting time limits. We said we're going to do this from 2 to 4, so dang it, we're going to be done at 4. So this is a really good list, and you're welcome to take these and kind of use them. We'll share all this material with you. Some of this was attached the other day or in that previous email with the invitation. There's often a moment, maybe I'll do this very briefly here, of saying what else might want to be on this list. So is there anything else that to you feels like it should be here, or should we feel comfortable with kind of it as it is? All right, I see some thumbs. Yeah, so fantastic. So like I said, this is something you're welcome to kind of take, and I know in the past KSRE in some fashion has used these principles and even in some scenarios kind of co-branded and the like. And so happy to have you do that. So the other thing here on the very front end, before I talk about a little bit of the kind of the historical piece, is really centrally this idea of the role of the facilitator. So I don't want to have a long conversation here, but just a few reactions, and it might be good actually to use the chat box if you're on a device that is relatively easy to do that. But what does it mean to engage as a professional with knowledge and expertise, obviously in some domain for you, right? So if you work in family consumer sciences, for example, maybe agriculture, maybe community development. But how do you use your knowledge and expertise in a way that kind of creates conditions for others, adults and youth alike, to engage topics and other people around them? So what's the role of the facilitator in this environment? So if you can, as I said a moment ago, the chat box seems like it might be the best route to do a little bit of this. Please feel free to kind of do this. And this will help guide us a little bit as we get into some of the discussions a little bit later. So I want to just leave this here for just a moment, but feel free even as I start to go forward, if you want to keep populating these comments in the chat box, right? So to guide without directing, to serve as a kind of a content neutral catalyst to guide discussion. Ron Wilson ends with a question mark, which is a good question. Engaging as many people in the room as possible, notions of impartiality, right? So I'm seeing some themes here. So this is good, and this will be here for us to continue to unpack a little bit later as we think about some of these processes. So yeah, so please keep this kind of coming, even as I move forward a little bit. So this role of the facilitator, let's keep thinking about what that means, or at least how you think about it, and maybe as we're reading from some others, what that means. So what I want to talk about here for just a few moments here is actually extension. So part of my work is, and please, like as I said, you can keep throwing some of this in the chat box. That'd be great. So part of my research as a scholar is actually about the history of extension and the land-grant university. And I have two quotes that I want to show here that capture, I think, some of the interesting dimensions that for me inform this idea of facilitation and community conversations. Clyde Warburton in 1930, who has an article called 6 Million Farms a School, asked this question: what's the point of extension, right? Is it about more corn or bales of cotton, right? Pounds of butter? It goes on. And drop down to that second piece. Better crops, better livestock, better food, better clothes. All these are among the objects of extension work, but back of it all, the ultimate purpose is to create better homes, better citizens, better communities, better rural living. And I pair this with Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was a horticulturalist and a really significant voice in the early extension movement. This is from his book in 1915 called The Holy Earth. And he says this, and I'll explain in a moment why I include this here. The college may be the guiding force, but it should not remove responsibility from the people of the localities or offer them a kind of cooperation that is only the privilege of partaking in the college enterprises. I fear that some of our so-called cooperation in public work of many kinds is little more than allow the cooperator to approve what the official administration has done. So as we think about our sense of self, who we are, and literally this is a year after the Cooperative Extension Service is established in 1914, these questions about how do we engage people around us is wrestled with. As many of you know, if not all of you, K-State is a land-grant university, the first operational land grant. And the image that sits in the US Capitol in the westward corridor is in fact an image that comes here from K-State. So this is in the Capitol and this is K-State. So when we think about our institution, this is kind of part and parcel to who we are. We've always had these kind of engaged dimensions through the Morrill Act that established land-grant universities, the Hatch Act, which some of you might be intimately involved with through some of the work that you do. And then particularly for us, the Smith-Lever Act in 1914 that really shaped and guided the sense of the institution going out, right? Extending the university, if you want to think about it that way. And some of the language that comes from this, right? The piece that most people know, right? It's about aiding and diffusing among people practical information about all sorts of things. It's about giving instruction and demonstrations and the like. And so as we think about kind of who we are, this is an important piece because in just a moment, I'm going to explain a little bit of some of this. So I'm showing you two images here. On top are your 5 grand challenges. But underneath it is this image, and it's one of my favorite visuals, not this particular image, but the palimpsest. That idea of something has been written on something else. And some of it's been kind of erased and it's been repurposed, especially in kind of ancient times, because paper was hard to come by. And when I think about the contemporary environment that we're in right now, there are so many pieces that are really rooted in kind of the sense of who we've been. And I want to talk about that for just a moment. So when we think about extension, for example, and here's a classic image that we might be familiar with. At the same time, we have these efforts of kind of cultivating group discussion, community conversations around the country and in rural places and beyond. There was a period, and particularly in the 1930s, where discussion ideas, discussion methods, for example, were really becoming kind of central work for land-grant universities. So this is actually from NC State. And so you get lots of books like this, different kind of ways of talking to each other. What you see, this is from this book, right, of town meetings and forums and panels, roundtables, things that we now just kind of take for granted. But at that time, were being really established and designed in such a kind of an explicit way. At this time, this is not explicitly extension, but there was this idea that people needed to be able to talk to each other. The New York Times has this article titled Beacon Lights of Democracy. And so you can actually see, if you look at number 10 there under that image, Wichita was one of these places that served somewhat as a hub of this idea of people convening in schools, in gymnasiums, for example, in the evening hours, and other places, Grange halls, to talk about, at that time, the future of something like a democratic society. If you can see on the right column to the right of that image, you can see that subheading, the anecdote for dictatorship, right? This idea of kind of democratic discussion really took hold. The reason I say all of this is that Extension was centrally involved in this work. This is a photo actually from Hale Library I took a number of years ago before the fire and everything. So I honestly don't know if these Extension bulletins from Illinois will return to the shelves. So I'm glad I snapped this photo. But in the midst of all of this, one of their circulars from the University of Illinois, from Extension, was this manual for group discussion. And the reason I show this here is it's such an interesting reminder, and I think for us an important one, that we might think about kind of our content areas as kind of the driving forces that shape so much of what we do. And in the midst of this, literally in the middle of it, is this idea of how does group discussion, how do these community conversations come to shape and inform some of that work? So we have people like the individual on the right there, his name was M.L. Wilson, who was really central to shaping this through the National Extension. He led it at that time. And the epigraph at the beginning of his book called Democracy Has Roots captures this. To those whose faith in democracy calls forth new methods to make it work. So what's he talking about? And I want to talk about a couple examples of what Extension did during this time. In the Extension Service Review, the forerunner to the Journal of Extension Now, in 1935, in an article titled Discussion Time is Here, he says this: free and full discussion is the archstone of democracy. There was a national effort across this country to really implement this idea of Extension playing a central role in convening and facilitating conversations in their communities. Kansas was one of the handful of states that kind of piloted this before it expanded across the country. And so what did this look like? Well, across this state, we had convenings of people in front rooms and in Grange halls, engaging in these discussion groups around a whole bunch of topics that I'll show you some of the titles in a moment. And then also they had these things called schools of philosophy that were these multi-day trainings. Think about your annual meetings, for example, that were really these opportunities for people to think about big ideas and questions, but it was wrapped up in this sense of how do we broaden how we think about our issues at hand. For them, the agricultural problem, including things like philosophy and culture and economics, all these pieces coming together, that was an important thing. It wasn't just about the kind of content that they would typically work on. It was wrapped up with these other themes. Kenyon Butterfield, who was the president of 3 land-grant colleges, wrote to M.L. Wilson about this work being the most important, as he says, one of the most significant developments in Extension work since Smith-Lever was passed, right? And so this idea of discussion being, and people facilitating Extension, facilitating these conversations has been, since its inception, part of what the mission has been. And so discussion guides look like this. The image on the right is one of these discussion guides. Tensions, or talking about the dynamics between urban and rural people. You can see some of these others on the left side. I'll show you another list so it's a little bit easier. So they talked about things like taxes, and they talked about things like soil conservation. So kind of environmental issues and questions. They talked about trade agreements. So a lot of the things that we talk about now, they were talking about as well. And so when we think about this, it wasn't just those adults sitting in those front rooms, for example, that you saw just a moment ago. This comes from Colorado State, just west of us, right? This whole question of how does this inform and shape the work that we're doing through youth development, for example, right? How do we help youth preserve democracy? Dynamics of the institutions that are part of our lives, and then also the other elements and kind of influences that shape that. So as we look back a little bit and then kind of move forward a bit here, our sense of an institution being one that engages people, and this is drawing from the Carnegie Foundation, K-State is recognized as an institution that's really committed to this work. We just were recertified for this last year. That when we think about collaboration between our institution, our university, kind of writ large, and our communities, right, the sense of the exchange of knowledge and resources and partnership and with reciprocity is something that we want to be thinking about too, as we think about how do we facilitate conversations and think about the resources that inform kind of who we are. So being an engaged kind of professional facilitating this work, well, what does this mean or require for us? Well, in one sense, it means we have to shift a little bit. It's not only being the expert or kind of the commentator, if you want to think about it this way, as you can see from Harry Boynton, and I'll include all this with kind of the material later. But it's not only about being kind of, and as some of the comments in the chat box earlier highlighted, right? It's about kind of being neutral. It has its place and purpose. And there are times when we have to think about how does that come into play, right? Where do we see ourselves as working with and kind of co-creating with people rather than only seeing the people we're engaging as kind of the consumers of a good or as kind of clients. And I recognize this is a thing we might want to talk about a little bit later or even after the session today. But the sense of kind of who we are is an important one to be reflecting upon. In a similar kind of fashion, John Saltmarsh talks about it from this idea of being expert-centered to more kind of democratic-centered. You can see that language of reciprocity, for example, of collaborating with rather than simply for. As we think about this idea of facilitating conversations and how to do this, we want to have in our minds the sense of as captured here, right? How do we do this in kind of relational, contextual ways rather than only, and not to the exclusion of, but not only as kind of a technical approach to, if we do this X, Y, Z, it will be fixed. Al Dezur says it this way. They are democratic professionals, people who do this kind of work this way, not because they do democracy really professionally, but because they do professionalism really democratically. So what does that look like and why does it matter right now? Well, we might want to have this, right? But so much of our kind of environment right now does not lend itself to people engaging and interacting much with one another. So being able to engage in civil discourse is a real challenge because we're in an environment where kind of the loudest voices dominate and shape either policy discussions or as you are familiar, and some of you might be co-located, for example, with your county commissioners and others, that the ways in which we engage in public discourse with one another is not always the idealized version of civil discourse. So there are kind of 4 quick things I want to do here. The first is the state of our kind of discourse. Across generations right now, we find from young people to older adults that from 2017, majority of people say this is the lowest point in our nation's history that they can actually remember. We find this in longitudinal data as well, right? The sense of our ability to engage one another is commonly held as a problem for both those who identify as Republican and Democrat. And across the board, 93% you can see over here on the left side, recognizing that this is a major, 69% say this is a major problem, with another quarter of people saying that this is a minor problem. This is held very steady. We've seen this for the last decade, that the sense of civility, and what we mean by that, I'll explain in just a second, is something that we have to recognize and address. This might feel uncomfortable for some folks because they don't want to step into the kind of the thick of it, but I think this is where we have a really critical role to play in this. So how do we maybe think about civility? One is civility as politeness. It's about kind of following the rules. Our ground rules, for example, would be one way to think about this. It's what allows us to talk. It's what's allowing me to speak right now, and you're attentively listening, or at least being muted, so thanks. But there's also the sense of civility as responsiveness, right? The sense of obligation to others. We might think about kind of the recent experiences we've been having with what are the actionable steps we can take to think and care for those around us in our communities. And so I would encourage us to think about civility somewhat in this way, that we want to, we really want to think about civility through this lens of responsiveness to other people, right? So how and why we're divided. We can look at the US Congress for the last half a century, and you can see the connections between people on the left and the right, kind of these thick lines and these thin lines for connections. And what we find, and this goes back to the middle of the 20th century, that you had people who had all sorts of interesting connections and relationships with one another. So you had liberal you had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and you had people who kind of crossed and had relationships and dynamics with those who were not, say, in their party. What comes, though, and you'll start to see it just about now, is there starts to be this kind of separation very, very easily through the 90s and then on. You can see the few people who would exist somewhere in the middle, and then largely they start to disappear, right? So when we think about some of the current challenges, we can use the US Congress as kind of a placeholder here, but we can think about it more locally as well. The challenge that we have in community conversations is that increasingly people want to kind of exist in these spaces where ideologically they are more uniform than in kind of common environments across party. Bill Bishop's book called The Big Sort captures a lot of this. I'm going to show you two images like an optometrist. This is before the sort, before people kind of clustered with like-minded groups, and I'm going to show you another one after. So here's the first one, and here's the second one. What you notice are the kind of the loss of the competitive counties, those that the margin was less than 20 points. It doesn't matter which party, for example, then becomes the landslide, but what happens, and Bishop's concern, and I would share this, is that we lose places where we have kind of the competing interests and discussions that allow us to have kind of a more robust, kind of diverse society. This gets updated just earlier this year. People's exposure to people of different views. You can see it kind of through this heat map. That exposure, that heat map on the bottom there, most people kind of fall in that yellow rather than the red, which means for a lot of people, even in places like New York City, you can see on the right, most people are not exposed to those with different views than them. This is a real challenge when we think about how do we want to proceed forward with addressing kind of common problems, and why it becomes important for you to be a facilitator and be able to step into that role for people around us. So why does this matter? And this part is almost done. Well, Hal Saunders, who's done a lot of work, he passed away just a few years ago, in international conflict zones. And I highlight a section of his book called A Public Peace Process because I think it's just so rich. He talks about dialogue as this process of genuine interaction through which human beings listen to each other deeply enough to be changed by what they learn. It's not necessarily that they do change, but that they can be changed. And so as we think about this idea of stepping into conversations with one another and what role...
Office. This is Kayla.
Oh, Kayla, can you mute, please? Thanks.
Yes. So I was wondering,
oh, hang on.
if you're interested in potentially judging our
I'm trying to figure out how to do this. I think we got it figured out. All right, good. So why does this become important? So if we're not trying to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah, I will do that.
Oh, still going. So if not consensus, then what? Listening deeply allows us to learn from others, right? And to recognize kind of their humanity. Yep, and this humility allows us to acknowledge. Oh, okay.
You too, bye.
It allows us to kind of see the world, not only how we perceive it, but through the eyes of others. And better understanding kind of what guides and shapes people's views is really essential for us. So it's not always about everybody being exactly on the same page. There will be moments we want to find common ground, but that listening to understand and getting to that place is a really important piece for us. So we have different models for thinking about this. We can think about this as debate, we can think about this as discussion, or we can move down towards things like dialogue and deliberation, right? The roots of these words get to this sense of exchange of meaning and kind of wrestling with this together. And as deliberation means, right, how do we weigh and kind of consider things together? For us, that's really what's going to be an opportunity as we kind of show a little bit, two models of this to you, this kind of dialogue work and leading a little bit more towards deliberation, this idea of being able to share and understand with one another. So there's these streams of engagement from the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation that allows us to kind of think about the right response or the right approach. So if we're trying to explore an issue together, it's going to be different than, say, taking collaborative action. And for some of you, it really might be, and oftentimes it is, the beginning of a conversation that's about exploration rather than necessarily saying we need to make a decision or we need to take some actionable steps. So when we think about exploration, right, it's about learning about themselves or their community or maybe actually an issue. And so World Cafe is one that shows up here, which is why we're going to demonstrate it in a little bit, because it's such a useful, helpful kind of first step. I'm going to kind of skip over this a little bit here just because we're going to unpack it in a moment. But the sense of World Cafe being this kind of easy process that for many of you, if you've never facilitated or feel comfortable doing it, this will be one that you can pick up. There are moments when we want to think about conflict too, though, of if there are certain dynamics that are going on within our communities, and maybe we've experienced that in the last year or so, that we really want to maybe use this framework, this lens of how do we want to approach this through this lens. Something like restorative justice gives us some language to think about, not simply a kind of a punitive addressing of an issue, but how do we think about things like accountability and safety and kind of growth and learning and community competency, a competency development that addresses our issues, but gets us away from maybe some of the models that we've known in the past. Whereas something like decision making, if you've ever used the National Issues Forums model, it's a helpful kind of process, allows us to unpack the tensions that exist with any issue. One that would look, here's an NIF guide around the issue of immigration, right? And for some of our communities across the state, kind of navigating the dynamics between wanting growth and welcoming people truly, and also recognizing that there are sometimes challenges that come with kind of the shifting of communities and of who we are. Any action we might take always has some drawback, right? And what are we willing to kind of accept with that? When we think about community conversations through the lens of decision making, it becomes an opportunity to really unpack, simply moving away from the kind of the simply left-right kind of orientation to looking at more of the nuanced approaches, which all inherently have their own issues. How do we think about that kind of common problem through that lens? Finally, is this sense of collaborative action, right? We've maybe talked about things long enough. It's ready. We're ready to move forward. There are certain approaches that maybe some of you experienced, things like study circles or maybe appreciative inquiry, that really allow you to actually make some progress going forward. So here's a conversation that took place here in Manhattan not long ago, a couple years ago, around issues of housing, right? And so the idea of people convening over a period of time together becomes a really important skill for people to have, being introduced to information, being able to wrestle with that with one another, and then being able to kind of move forward as they're navigating some of those questions. So as we think about these streams of engagement, there's a lot of different ways we can think about this. We're not going to go through all of this by any stretch. We're going to talk about a couple things here, but I want to leave us with this. All of these kind of dialogue and deliberation practices hopefully lead us to this, right? That we're open to the consideration of new information, right? That maybe I have changed my mind, as Houslander says. If I've listened so deeply, I might be changed. This idea of engaging, listening to understand, not just other people, but other perspectives, becomes a really important skill set for us to have as we think about facilitating. So what we're going to do is actually kind of transition to having a little bit of a presentation around visual thinking strategies, kind of an introduction to what this is. And we're actually going to have an experience of this. So in just a moment, Lance Rossi is going to kind of take over here. I'm going to turn this off, and I'll let him kind of step into this. But we're going to do this for a little bit, and then we're going to talk about what visual thinking strategies is, and actually how this could be useful, and I would say really useful to a number of you in the spaces where you are. So let me go ahead and turn it over there.
I figure out how I can share screen and unmute myself at the same time.
Buttons, man, buttons. Go ahead. Thank you.
So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Tim introduced me, my name is Lance Rossi. I'm a grad student at Kansas State University in the Communication Studies program. Hopefully, Dr. Shaffer and his colleagues will give me their blessing at the end of this week, and I'll be graduating this summer. I also do a research assistantship with the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy, where I work on the Kansas Civic Life Project. We're real excited to have this kind of partnership with the Research and Extension Department. And I'm excited personally to kind of share some of the things I've been learning over the last couple of years, because I think they'll be useful in having some constructive conversations in your particular areas of interest. As Dr. Shaffer was mentioning, there's different streams of engagement depending on the outcome that you want to have from a particular conversation. The ones we're going to be discussing today are exploratory in nature. I'm first going to cover visual thinking strategies, which is actually a pretty fun exercise coming out of art education that allows us to understand that people see a lot of the same things differently, and that you can look at a piece of art and be open to interpretation, especially from others, and consider how they might see the same thing that you're looking at. This becomes useful when we bring this over to more substantive conversations, which you might hold a World Cafe for, to take the temperature on how a particular group of people view a particular issue. So as a priming exercise, visual thinking strategies becomes valuable. Okay, so it was developed in coordination between a cognitive psychologist, Abigail Husson, and art educator, Philip Yanowain. I've probably butchered both of those names, so if you're familiar with them, my apologies. But it encourages critical thinking, communication, and visual literacy skills. It comes, as I said, out of art education, where we were trying to get museum visitors to think more deeply about the art that they were viewing. Interestingly, it transfers into some of the sciences. There's a study that showed medical students who were given a training on visual thinking strategies versus their non-trained counterparts actually developed better, more nuanced and comprehensive documentation of the different physical examinations they were conducting in their studies. We as dialogue and deliberation practitioners also find value in this because it kind of coordinates with a lot of the values of civil discourse that we're trying to elicit from the participants to our conversations. So in just a second, I'm going to show an image. It's a piece of art, and I want everyone to just take a minute to view it and reflect, and maybe not respond immediately. What we'll do is we'll use the hand raise function, and there's a large group of us today, so we probably won't get to hear from everyone. But after about a minute of viewing this, if you wanted to raise your hand, we'll go down the list and try to get as much as we can in the time we have allotted for this exercise. So just I'll switch this slide, and let's just take a moment, and then I'll prompt us to start gathering your input. Can everyone view that? Is anyone having an issue of just in the chat function if you want to? Oh, I'll go back. I think on my screen, I can see enough of it. I'm assuming from silence that it's showing up well on your side. So I'll just be quiet here. We'll give you a minute, just reflect on this. Think about, not only the subject, but also what else is going on around the subject in this particular piece. So I don't have the usual participants tab because I'm sharing screen. Dr. Shaffer, I don't know if you can readily look. If you'd like to comment, I really encourage you to hit the raise hand button, and maybe Dr. Shaffer, you can call on them as they come up.
Yeah, I can watch there. So if you know the hand raise function, so I think part of the prompting is, what do you see? So Chase, I see Chase's hand here.
So yeah, that's the prompt. The first prompt that you want to ask in this protocol is, what is going on in this picture? So let's go to Chase.
Yeah, there's quite a bit happening in this picture from what I can see. Immediately, I can my eyes are drawn to the center with this girl who seems to be balancing due to her foot position. It looks like she's kind of balancing on this round object. But what's really intriguing to me is the center, like the central color of this piece tends to be dark red, and it kind of like brings out this feel of like possibly like a change in political power. You can see this, what appears to be a soldier in the bottom left, like a military uniform. I am also noticing flag bearers. Kind of reminds me of 1930s Germany. You can kind of see like the Columbian like star there that the Nazis used that. So possibly a change in political power and wherever this might be. I also see what appears to be like looks like in the top right, a man dressed in something like a very traditional, like revolutionary uniform, perhaps. Can't really tell from the hair. It makes it seem like a really old timey. I don't know why, but that's kind of what I'm drawn to immediately.
Okay. Excellent. Chase. What I hear you saying is that your eyes are immediately drawn to the subject in the middle. A young girl performing a balancing act of sorts. But in the background, you're drawing more context out of probably some of the other figures there, indicating some kind of political changeover. Is that accurate?
That is, yes.
Okay. What more can we find? Is there anyone else who'd like to contribute?
You can do the hand raise, or you can just also, if it's easier. Oh, Francis, go ahead. You gotta unmute though first.
Got it. Thank you.
I know. We're still saying that, right?
So she looks like a performer of some sort to me, with the ring and the curtain that's being kind of taken to the side, and her hand positioning. She kind of reminds me of like a circus type posture. And then the fact that she's blindfolded seems really young, kind of makes me troubled as I look at her.
Would you mind speaking a little bit more to that feeling of troubled? What do you see that makes you say that kind of reaffirms outside of the blindfold?
Well, we're looking at her, but she can't look back at us. She can't return our gaze, and she's in a precarious physical position.
Okay. So what I hear you saying is you have a sense of concern for this, for the subject of this kind of art piece, the main focal point. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. What more can we find? We'll probably have time for one more, and then I'll move into a little explanation about what we're doing here.
And if you can't figure out how to raise your hand, you could also just unmute. That's fine.
Right.
I don't think anyone's mentioned the crown that's kind of hovering above her head.
Okay, excellent. What does the crown speak to you in any kind of way? Do you think you can draw any conclusions from the crown being there, or what about the crown draws your interest in?
I don't know, with the kind of political theme that's been mentioned, is maybe that is she going to be placed in a position of power? Kind of a young nation budding in a way or something, kind of teetering on, the volatility of something that's, new and uprising. I mean, that's kind of what I've gathered from it.
Okay, this is very interesting. I think that the last comment kind of inferred a sense of concern for the subject. But what I hear you saying is perhaps this is sort of a rite of passage, that maybe this is kind of her being crowned or recognized in some sort of way. Is that accurate?
I think so.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm going to move along to kind of go through how these questions are worded and why they're worded a certain way. They're worded deliberately. So the first prompt that should be given by the facilitator is, what's going on in this picture? This is an open-ended question. Going on implies that it's open to interpretation, and that anyone can contribute what they feel is important. What do you see that makes you say that? And I'm grateful that everyone kind of just offered evidence for their claims automatically without having to be prompted. But what we want to avoid is listing. We don't want someone to say, I see the woman in the middle of the image, and not give any kind of elaboration as to why that was important or why that drew their attention in. So we ask for visual evidence, not just what they think, and also to explain to others how the person sees something. So when I think of Chase, he gave a litany of all his reasonings for the interpretation that he was making. And what we want is for others to listen to that and understand how someone else might view the same image, even if they don't necessarily agree. And we saw in the last example that there's a little disagreement between what the nature of the character in the middle was, right? So what we want to do is kind of encourage multiple answers by asking, what more can we find from looking at this image? And this promotes flexible thinking. What I tried to do, and I'm a novice at this, I'm gonna just go ahead and disclose this at that point. But we want to try and paraphrase as the facilitator. We want to stay neutral. If I was going to critique myself on doing that right there, I would pay particular attention to my habit of saying excellent after receiving a certain viewpoint, right? Like my job is to stay neutral, and maybe that might be a little too confirming. So we want to affirm, and we want to use the paraphrasing to kind of confirm what the participant is offering the group, to make sure that we're clear about their viewpoint. So we use conditional language that attaches a certain claim to the participant who offered it, but try not to recognize it as right or wrong. Right? We want to keep things open to interpretation. So as we encourage other people to join by asking, what more do we see? We don't stifle differing perspectives. The other thing you want to try to do is link thoughts. When there's agreement or disagreement, note that, but also note that it's okay to disagree respectfully. And so from this exercise, it's emerging in the field of deliberative discussion, because it has a lot of common sense ways that it relates to the ground rules and principles for civil discussion. And so this is the last slide I'll show on visual strategies. And I might pause for a moment to just allow any kind of clarifying questions about what we've covered so far. But you can see that, for instance, seeking understanding and common ground relates to it because VTS offers multiple views with a chance of revision of thoughts. We can explore conflicting viewpoints by asking, what more can you find? Encouraging multiple answers, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to read this slide to you, but I'll leave that there for a moment and then perhaps pause in case anyone has any questions. Feel free to chime in at this point.
And Lance, for some reason, at least I'm seeing some of your slide cut off. And so if others are seeing it that way, we'll make sure you kind of see all this.
I wonder if I can swap. Does that help?
Oh, yes. There we go. Fantastic. Thank you.
So before I move on, I just want to pause and see if there's any questions about what we've covered so far, the process itself, maybe your role as a facilitator of it, concerns with paraphrasing, so on and so forth.
Deborah, if I can call you out here for a moment. I know you said, quote, VTS is awesome earlier. Is that something you've done before? I don't know if Deborah's searching for an unmute button or, well, let me also pose it this way. Has anybody ever done or experienced VTS before? And how do you see it fitting with kind of the idea of helping people think about something that, doesn't necessarily have a super clear answer? Yeah, I saw Chase's hands there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been a part of this exercise multiple times in classroom settings, especially as kind of like a taste tester or like an appetizer to a broader or sorry, a deeper discussion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And did you find that experience to be helpful? Like this kind of, yeah, you're saying, can you say more?
It's a very good way to like you said, it's a very good way to kind of gauge the room and kind of feel like kind of get to people, get to know people's communication differences and kind of be able to accommodate for that later in the discussions.
Great, thanks. So there's a question here from Rachel saying, curiosity has been piqued. What's the name of the painting, right? Which, and Susan's now also saying, still thinking about the goat in the picture. Why the heck is there a goat? So
I'm gonna stop share for just a
yeah,
moment.
let's go this way. I mean,
I have it up.
and we have just a few minutes for, and because we'll have a chance to kind of unpack this along with the World Cafe in a bit, but there's a few things here. So if it'd be interesting, so lots of questions about the goat. So I don't know, Lance, do you have the info on that particular painting title?
I do, and I'm trying to pull it up just now.
Okay.
Struggling with my presentation being up at the moment.
No, that's
I'm gonna get it. I'll drop it in the box.
That'd be fantastic. So maybe while Lance is doing that, one of the things where VTS. So when I first learned about VTS, I was kind of like, why do I have to look at a painting, and especially a painting that kind of looks strange, or at least in my mind, kind of looks strange. And what I realized, and I think Chase was talking about this a little bit, and I think Donna in the chat box also put this in text, that it really can be helpful in a way that it's this kind of interesting, like neutral out there. You're not asking anybody to get real deep about the thing that you're probably convening. And so VTS can be really helpful to kind of get people primed to, have an immediate observation, maybe see something, and then also hear what other people see. So for some images, right, some people are like, I didn't even see that, right? And so not even being aware of everything that's going on, or maybe its importance and why. And so sometimes frustratingly, but I also recognize about myself that there's a real benefit to this kind of like listening. What else is somebody else saying? Because there have been moments I've looked at photos. I use this example all the time. There was a horse, and the person who was facilitating was like, so the image that you say looks like a horse because, and I just wanted to scream that it's a horse. But I realized part of the experience is not immediately kind of jumping in that way, because there's something to really unpack. Donna, do you have anything else to say about VTS particularly? I know you've used VTS quite a bit.
It's a wonderful way for people to all recognize that there are no right and wrong answers in many of our discussions, but key to the discovery is the recognition that some people will go down one path of interpreting and others will take another path. And it's the respect for those different paths that is such a valuable learning for all of us.
Oh, great, thank you. And we should know that the Beach Museum here at K-State has done a lot of work around VTS. And so they are always very happy and interested to engage with people around this work. And so they've been a great partner for ICDD. And it's a place that if some of this is interesting to you, they can also help find images, because VTS doesn't work with just every image. There are some that it's really good, like the one we were just looking at a moment ago, that helps people to kind of wrestle with basically ambiguity. So we're going to turn it back over to Lance, and now we're going to have a little bit different experience, some explanation of a process, and then we're going to actually participate in some of the World Cafe structure in just a bit.
So I did drop the title and the art credit for that image into the chat box. So if you're super interested, you'll be able to reference it later.
I don't see it there, so maybe you didn't hit
No?
it yet.
Oh, darn it.
Oh, it's okay. You know what? We'll get it
I
later.
am not the Zoom guy. Okay. So our next exploratory process is referred to as World Cafe. Dr. Shaffer mentioned it in his presentation. Really, this process is designed not really for Zoom. It's meant to create an atmosphere that inspires the kind of communication that we want. And so you would take a large group like we have today, 37 so on folks, and break them into smaller groups in an actual cafe atmosphere, tables with tablecloths, perhaps a beverage around, kind of creating that intimate kind of conversational and informal atmosphere that encourages people to open up and to share. But the real thing we want to, well, go on to my first slide. There's 7 design principles. I want to discuss a few of these. And the first is getting to a question that matters. The question that you pose is pretty consequential. You, of course, would like to avoid leading questions, questions that are closed and don't really allow for a lot of exploration, questions that people have a real stake in answering, right? They pique interest, it matters to their daily lives, and they engage a diverse range of thinking. They're thought-provoking, they stimulate creativity, and they are broad enough that they can be interpreted different ways by different groups. The hospitable space is really a central part to the design as I'm explaining the atmosphere and how that goes to the kind of environment that encourages discussion and the sharing of ideas, the listening to other people's perspectives and viewpoints. And this mutual listening is really like a center point of this exploration process. So as we did in the visual thinking strategies, we want to open ourselves up to the interpretation of others. How do we see other people's viewpoints? Some folks might go to a communication style that values objective data. Other people might like to share a story of how that data is contextualized in their daily lives. Neither has more value than the other. They're just different ways of viewing it. And by coming together with what was referred to as a spirit of inquiry and an earnest desire to understand how our community, how our collective views a particular situation so that we can come away with a better understanding of where we are as a group. I am alternating between the presentation and my notes, so I apologize. So the process itself looks like this. You pose a question, a start-off question that speaks to kind of the theme around the World Cafe discussion. Within that round, groups of 4 to 5 people is how it would be typically routinely executed. Those groups would talk, write, and doodle different ideas, new questions directly on the tablecloth sometimes. You might have the butcher board block for note-taking. There'll be a host that remains at the table while the other folks rotate to a different one in subsequent rounds. You would have multiple rounds for multiple questions, or maybe a single question that's visited several times in different groups. And what this does is it encourages a cross-pollination of ideas. Within a larger group, how can we draw the insights from the intimate setting where sharing and openness is more likely to a larger group where we then harvest those ideas and try to draw major themes seen from the group as a whole. As a table host, you're not necessarily a facilitator of the discussion. You're acting as a recorder. It would be helpful to remain mindful of, are we on the question? Are we not on the question? Are we speaking with one another in a civil way? But really we're there to maintain the ideas of the table and cross-pollinate them to the next group, the subsequent groups that rotate through that area of inquiry. You want to make your notes brief, but clear and legible. As we did in VTS, you want to try to paraphrase contributions to confirm what they're saying or clarify where there's any misunderstanding. Treat them all equally. Again, stay neutral as much as you can. And when reporting to the harvesting session, keep those contributions anonymous. You don't necessarily want to call someone out in the larger group and say, well, this person thinks this way. On your notes, you can use different tags. Like this is a common question that showed up in multiple discussions. You can use a question mark for that. When people confirm the same point, hashtags to track that. And where you find people really coming together around a certain idea and agreement, an exclamation point for consensus. And these are just little helpful tags to help you as a host track and record the events as they unfold. You're still a part of the conversation as a host. But really what we want to do is maintain what is coming out of the conversation at a certain table from a smaller group and transfer to the larger group through these analysis of major themes that unfold. I have prepared, based on your survey responses in registering for this event, a short analysis of 2 questions. The first being, what is our knowledge and use of facilitation in public discussion? We scored on average about 4.28, which is an average response. Some folks were higher, some folks were lower. But this chart kind of shows when we transfer those answers from far below average to far above average to a Likert scale of sorts, where we exist as a group, as a collective, with our knowledge and use of these different public engagement strategies. Going further with the question of what is one challenge or concern you have about engaging people in public discussion, I did a thematic analysis based on your responses. I didn't have responses from everyone, and those that didn't answer were omitted. But the major themes I created a dictionary for, ranging from conflict apprehension, facilitation and experience, equity and inclusion, resource and design, so on and so forth. These were the concerns that were voiced. And I did my best to try to situate your responses within one of these major themes. Excuse me. What we found was the 2 major ones were conflict apprehension and facilitation and experience. These seem to be the major concerns of the group as a whole. Tied for third was equity and inclusion, resource and design, and participant incivility. While participant incivility was closely related with conflict apprehension as a concern, the comments themselves indicated that they were concerned about a particular individual to a discussion, creating a hostile environment for the others. So within this group, when we bring them up on the chart based to our means, as a total group, the mean was 4.25. And in this area of conflict apprehension, we see a raise in the range, but not necessarily the mean. So we're all kind of in this group, slightly above, slightly below average. But some of us, the majority of us, had a concern of conflict apprehension. We wanted to have conversations that are civil, but we were concerns about how we as a facilitator encourage that dynamic in our conversation. The other thing was facilitator inexperience. And as you see, the range drops down just a little bit. As you would expect, someone with inexperience who self-reports their knowledge and use to be a little bit moderately less than average. So I just share this today to set the context for the question for our first round of World Cafe. And then Dr. Shaffer will break us down into smaller groups. We'll explore this question, kind of bringing over those ideas from visual thinking strategies and how we want to, in particular, listen to the other's perspective, reflect on it genuinely and earnestly, and also offer our own perspective within the context of the question at hand. So the question I've prepared for you is straight off of the survey. What is one challenge or concern you have about engaging people in public discussion? I'm personally curious to see how we talk about this in person as a group, even though we're on Zoom, but when we're together in this conversation versus how one might speak about it in a survey. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Shaffer to do the groups, and then we'll return after a short period to kind of reflect, share our experience, and then engage another question.
Yeah, so as I look at our numbers, we were not sure exactly how many would show up. So we had to think about a couple strategies. But the fact that the numbers that we have, we can do groups of about 10 or 11. And then Lance, myself, and Donna could be table hosts if we'd like to do that and let everybody else kind of experience if that feels like an okay thing. Does that feel too big? Ideally, we'd be a little bit smaller, but with the composition of the groups, I wonder if that makes sense. People feel okay with that size? Donna, do you think that that's a reasonable for? This is also where, as Lance said a moment ago, this is really designed for being in a kind of a common room, and there's butcher paper on tables and kind of a slightly different dynamic. I think for our purposes, kind of showing what this can look like and kind of an online space, I think this will be good. If that sounds okay. So what I'm going to do is I've got us in three rooms, and just accept. In a moment, I'm going to open the rooms right now, and you've been invited to join one of the breakout rooms. You can go ahead and go to that. We'll do about 10 minutes, and we'll come back. And if anybody has trouble, I will help you. And Lance, you're in one. Cassie or Carol or Berta or David, can I help you? David or Carol or Cassie, can I help you where the buttons are? Recording again here. I said all that really good stuff. Now we hit record. So so let's talk a little bit about this experience of this kind of facilitated structure. World Cafe, obviously we just experienced. BTS, we talked about a little bit ago and experienced. So how can this, from your experience briefly here even today, how can some of this show up for you? So obviously some of the discussions that just occurred, that would be a natural place to maybe say a bit of that here. But you can also then, draw in some of the thoughts you have about something like VTS. Maybe another way to rephrase it here too is, and people can just talk, or you can do the raise hands function. Some of you, I know, already are using some of this kind of structured dialogue and things in your work, but presumably a number of you aren't. So how does this show up for those of you who are already doing some of this, but for some of you who aren't, where do you see some possibility here? So say Ron's typing. Do you want to say any of this? So in a small group, do you consider appropriate to call out someone who is not spoken by name and ask them to speak? It's a good question. So people have different stylistic approaches and responses. Mine typically is, as our ground rules at the beginning kind of highlight, give people opportunities to speak, but don't necessarily force it. I don't know if others, I don't know, Donna, if you would have a different response to that. My experience is sometimes people show up, as some of the discussions kind of highlighted, people show up for different reasons. And so sometimes it's about first listening and just figuring out, like, maybe I'm new to a community or what's going on, and you're just trying to get the kind of the read of the landscape. And so my default is give people the opportunity rather than kind of a forced, kind of like a talking stick almost in certain situations. But I don't know, Donna, if do you have any other, would you have a response to that question from?
Well, I guess I illustrated it in the first instance because I could see people, many of whom I knew, and I actually did call on people.
Yeah.
Also, just before we were sent back, I said, who hasn't said anything? And I did name a couple of people, but with the ruse that our time was limited and I didn't want them to be left out.
Yeah. So I actually, I think this is a nice, great question. And I think also highlighting the variation of, like, depending on familiarity can be a big factor, right? It's easy to be like, hey, because actually, Ron, before I saw you typing, I almost poked you because I wanted somebody to say something, right? And so there's this sense of some of that without kind of, unless, right, you really do want / need to have and ensure that you've got those. But like, this is where you've got some variation, that there's not kind of a lockstep approach. But it's an important one, because you also want to think about these as not just simply one-time moments. And so what's the potential situation that if you've forced someone, all of a sudden they're not maybe back again, and that would be an unfortunate thing. What other questions or comments or thoughts? Maybe voices we haven't heard, to that point, voices that we haven't heard from yet would be good too. She does look like she's ready to say something. I can, no, she's not unmuted. It sure seems like she's about to say something now. Say that. That's the subtle approach. But she still didn't answer it, and I'm not going to force it. But I will poke it a little bit, right? So you can play this game a little bit of, you know. Anybody else?
I just wanted to point out, like, sometimes as a facilitator of these discussions, there's an internal pressure to fill the silence.
Yeah.
And that is not necessarily always a thing. People might be taking time to reflect on what someone else has said, and that's something that should be encouraged as well. So allowing a little bit of space for silence is not necessarily a bad thing, just to fill the silence.
It's absolutely true. When I teach small group communication classes, there's milliseconds that typically separate how we speak. And if I was just on vacation with my mother, and I was reminded of how she really doesn't like silence. And there are moments when, like, our conversation would probably benefit from some of that. So some of this is just our inclinations. Yes, the pausers, the overlappers, and the like are things and this is, I'll say a little bit here, and then we'll still have some space like this. But this is where, this experience is just a little bit, this is really brief, right, in a couple things. But if you're interested in some of these kinds of more focused kind of questions and such, this is where ICDD can be really helpful. Happy to be a resource for something similar to this, but also in a more kind of targeted way of, like, Wyandotte County or wherever else, right? That's why. See, I'm still calling you out, but you're still not answering.
I will say something, just because what you said just really resonated with me. We're doing a trauma training for different agencies, and we just had this on Friday. So it was interesting that you guys are having this conversation about silence, because one of the ladies, she said, I'm such a processor. And so she said, so by the time someone said something, it takes me so long. And by that time, it's time to either get, to leave, or the conversation, or I've almost forgot about what I wanted to say. So I think that, sometimes silence, I think as facilitators, we take it as we have to fill every moment, or sometimes that's okay. And we have to understand that that people do process at different levels. So I do a little bit of poking, like you were saying, if someone looks like they want to say something, or if they unmute themselves, I will do that. But I personally do not like to call people out, because I feel like sometimes they will shut down and they may not share. Now, that's not the case with everything, but a lot of it, I think, is a topic. Like I said, we're talking about trauma. So I found that the group that we had, they were a lot more talkative in the smaller groups rather than being in the larger group. And we're not even recording it. And I don't know about you all, but I've also found that the more we're recording, people are talking less, I think, because I don't know if they're just afraid they're going to say something and it's going to get out there and they're going to be judged for it. So I think we have to look at all the things that are going on when we think about that silence, especially when a lot of our sessions are being recorded now.
Yeah.
That's my 2 cents. See, I bet you won't call on me again.
Nope, I marked you off my list, so I'm not. Now I'm moving on. Somebody else get ready. No, I mean, I mean, a great point, right? I mean, this is where you also have to navigate and figure out, and this is part of why practicing this can be really helpful. I will just highlight something that Donna put in to the chat box. We at ICDD have something I love the language. They're called workouts, right? And so these are chances to kind of flex your civic muscles of doing some of this facilitation work. And there are a couple, actually, one coming up on Wednesday and another one later this month, to where if any of this kind of feels like, I feel like I'd want to just kind of get better at this, right? Truly kind of work out. We have these opportunities both online. There will be some face-to-face chances. So I would encourage you to take a glance at some of that. And Donna, the best way, we should probably just, ICDD at KSU, is that?
Yeah. These workouts are designed to address one or two of what people bring to the table as their deepest concerns. So in our first session, several of those people had mentioned, what do you do when there's dominance? Well, the question that these two workouts, Wednesday night and the following 26th Saturday, is this: what do you do when somebody says something and all the oxygen goes out of the room? So we have it's very informal. It's a heck of a lot of fun. And we get to role play, and it's just like a playground for facilitators in a safe space to deal with their worst fears. And that's the theme. So I encourage you to email ICDD if you're interested and have time for this Wednesday night or the following Saturday. Just look at the ICDD website and all the details are there.
And that's in the chat box. And also we've just Lance put it there. We have a number of resources too, some materials that were included in that calendar invite previously, but there was another question about slides and things. That email list that signed up for this stuff will go there to you. So you should expect these. We'll probably include a few things for you. But there are some resources that will help kind of give you some understanding of this. Even I think Chase put in the chat box, right, the sense of different styles of how we communicate, and as a facilitator to be aware of that is a hugely important thing, because recognizing that, and we just talked about, and we have just a few minutes, and so if there's a little bit more, particularly about something like VTS or World Cafe that could be useful, I think might be helpful for others to hear. Because this is, these are two low stakes, right? They don't take extensive training to do it, right? What you just experienced, you yourself could, with a little bit of guidance and some resource to even maybe some of the prompts and questions and things of that sort. But this doesn't require you to be so extensively trained that it's going to be impossible for you ever to start, which is also why some of the opportunities through the workouts and the like could be really, I think, beneficial. So you start to feel more confident and comfortable with some of this kind of work. So any kind of final, we just have a few minutes, final reactions to the two experiences that you had, the VTS and World Cafe, and how they might actually show up for you in the work that you do? I don't know if it's a show of hands or anything like that, but does this feel like a possibility that they could integrate in some way to the roles that you have? I'm seeing a nod from Ron. I see a lot of other still photos, so it's hard to gauge. Oh, there we go. Those yellow thumbs. Okay. The rest of you, I don't know what you're going to do, but as I said, we do have a lot of resources that we'll share with you all, the material from today. But if you do have any questions, that email that we gave you, ICDD@KSU, you can inquire there. It's kind of a distribution thing, so a number of us will receive it. So if you have questions or any kind of needs in your communities, one of the things that there's currently a grant that we have that's kind of mapping some of this work, but also is designed to be able to be responsive to people who are doing some of this work and trying to. And so there's the opportunity, seeing this truly as like a little bit of a taste. And so if there's interest in kind of a next step, please don't hesitate to reach out. I might do some following up on that front as well, just because our interest, and I've said this for literally years now, I can say that with Trudy, that the different areas of the university need to collaborate and work more together. And this is one of those places where it just makes a lot of sense. And I think for the sake of our communities and the vitality of our places and the people within them, we need to do a better job of engaging. So thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. I do hope this window of time gave you a little sense of some of the history and the context of why it's not some radical idea for Extension to be doing this work, and in some ways kind of reclaiming some really deep roots. And at the same time, recognizing that we're in a really challenging moment in our country's history. And that doesn't mean we have to stop engaging and talking with one another, to finding places to where we can have certain levels of agreement and sometimes not, right? And so being able to also navigate those waters as well. So yes, so I would be very happy, as I said, and others to collaborate with you, whether it's youth focused. There's a lot of work happening in that space, also for adults, and in kind of respective areas. So thank you. If there's nothing else, any other words, let me just say thank you. Jan has been my point person on some of this, and Trudy, you've both kind of actually gotten me to move forward. So thank you. And I look forward to actually getting to know a lot of you going forward.
Thanks.
Nothing like the silent clap. I love it. Thanks, everybody.